Well, hello and welcome to another Zoom session for 110. Today is, March the 19th, 2019, and we will talk about something completely different. We're no longer in the land of acoustics. We are now in the land of psychoacoustics, perception of sound. Well, here's hoping your spring break went okay and that the midterms are all done. I just came back from the Missouri Hearing Society conference and had a great time. It was good to see everybody there. And what was really interesting, though, is getting stuck at the Springfield airport. I was there for 8 hours. My plane was delayed due to mechanical difficulties, and I missed my flight out of Dallas. So, yeah, I got home a little bit later than I had planned. Anyway, here goes. Let's look at our notes from Unit 4, Psychoacoustics, Thresholds. So let's take a peek over here, share screen, and look at the notes. Psychoacoustics, concepts of threshold. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. You see all kinds of words on there, but let's just break it down, okay? Threshold, threshold methods, threshold types, dB references, and binaural hearing. And there's your readings, Chapter 5, Chapter 8, out of Lassen, Woodford, Hearing Science Fundamentals. What's threshold? Threshold. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second here and just talk at you. What is threshold? Threshold is the doorway. Okay, it's where you enter the room. Threshold is when sound enters you. In other words, when you hear it. It's the softest it takes to hear. Okay, you're hearing threshold. And when people talk about threshold, they often make a symbol for it so that it's shorter. And I'll just draw that for you. Looks like that, a circle with a line in it. Okay, and just make a little circle with a line in it when you're writing down anything, because that means threshold. That little symbol is the Greek letter for theta, T-H-E-T-A, theta, T-H. So it's threshold, okay? That's what people draw that. It just makes it shorter instead of writing the whole word. Threshold is generally the softest it takes to do something, softest sound you can hear. And that's what you're going to be testing and hearing all the time, okay? You're going to be testing thresholds. Thresholds for the right ear for hearing 1,000 hertz, threshold for the right ear for hearing 2,000 hertz, 4,000 hertz, 8,000 hertz. It really hurts. Okay, and then once you've tested the right ear at all those frequencies, now you're going to move to the left ear and present under headphones. What's the softest level it took for the person to hear in that ear? And you're going to write down as hearing thresholds. Did it take 30 dB? Was it 25 dB? What intensity was required for the person to just barely hear? Okay, let's share screen now and then look at the notes that we've got. The first thing to digest here is differential threshold. Differential threshold. Let's just cover this guy here. And once we've covered it, then we can leave it in the rear view mirror and just say sayonara to it, okay? Good. Differential threshold applies more to research than to us, okay? But what they're doing is the sound is already audible. You just want to know what's the smallest change you can make to the sound for the person to notice a sound, notice a change. And you can do that along each of the 3 dimensions of sound: frequency, intensity, or time. Okay, so let's talk frequency for the heck of it. If you're hearing 1,000 hertz, if I make it 1,001 hertz, were you able to hear that there was a change? Or did I have to make it about 1,005 hertz for you to notice that there was a change in frequency? Okay? And they call this the just noticeable difference, JND. Another word is difference Lyman. They're all the same thing. Differential threshold, difference Lyman, JND, just noticeable difference, and a fourth one is delta. And that's done by the good old a triangle. And I'll stop sharing and show you here. A triangle. Delta. You can have delta F. You can have delta intensity. You can have delta time. Okay? And all that means is, what was the smallest difference you needed to make for the person to notice a difference? Remember now, the sound is already heard. It's audible. Okay, the sound is already there. Let's say I'm playing you 1,000 hertz at 50 dB SPL. You can hear it, no problem. Okay, what's the smallest frequency change I needed to make for you to notice that there was a change in frequency? Now let's hold the frequency at 1,000 hertz, and we're presenting it to you at 50 dB SPL. When I presented it to you at 51 dB SPL, were you able to hear a difference? Okay, that's the whole thing. Were you able to hear that? Or did I need to make it about 53 or 55 for you to notice that there was a difference in intensity? Delta I. Okay, and so on. So what's the smallest change you needed to make to an already audible sound for you to notice that there was a difference? And you can do that along the dimension of frequency. You can do that along the dimension of intensity. You can do that along the dimension of time. Okay, you can make, I can play two tones and go, da, da. Did you hear two tones? Da, da. Did you hear two tones? Da, da. What's the smallest little time interval I could make before you couldn't hear that there was two different tones? Yeah. So people play with research like this, but not to worry. I'll share screen now and show you a PowerPoint slide that deals with differential threshold. There you go. Blow it up. Okay, let's just look at this guy just for the heck of it. This is talking about delta F, frequency. Notice the horizontal axis is frequency from 100 to 10,000 cycles per second, or 10,000 hertz. And the vertical axis is delta F. What's the smallest change in frequency that was needed to be made for the person to notice that there was a change? And you'll notice all these lines going fairly flat, and then whoop, they're shooting up in the air. That's because they represent the intensity of the sound. Were all the sounds presented at 5 dB? Were the sounds presented at 10? Were the sounds presented at 80, 20? Let's look at the squares. Look at the black ones. Okay, so let's say the sounds were presented to the person at 80 dB SPL. Okay, and then what you wanted to notice, well, what was the smallest change you needed to make at 200 hertz for the person to notice that there was a change? Not much. Look at that. And at 400 hertz or 500 hertz, what was the biggest change required for the person to notice a change? Not much. Not much here, not at 1,000. At 2,000, when you got beyond 3,000, you needed to make more of a change in frequency for the person to notice that there was a change. And you needed to make about, well, how much? Let's follow my cursor right at this frequency here. We'll pretend that's 4,000 hertz, because this is 3 and that's 5. And at 4,000 hertz, we needed to make about 10 dB, 10 hertz different. In other words, if I presented 4,000 hertz, I needed to make the sound about 4,010 hertz for the person to notice a change in frequency. And when you go higher up in frequency, like to 8,000 hertz, at 8,000 hertz, presenting the tone at 80 dB, how much change did I need to make for you to notice that there was a change from 8,000 hertz? Well, follow about 80. So at 8,000 hertz, you couldn't hear a change in frequency until it was 8,080 hertz. Okay? If I made it 8,001 hertz, you wouldn't notice a difference. 8,002, you wouldn't notice a difference. 8,010, you wouldn't notice a difference. 8,020, you wouldn't notice the difference. And so on until you got to about 8,080 hertz. Then you'd start to say, oh yeah, I can hear a change. Yeah, it's a different, that's a slightly different pitch. Oh yeah. Huh. See? Delta F. Stop sharing. We'll leave that one alone now, because that's what research does. Okay, they're examining the smallest changes you need to make to an already audible sound for you to notice that there was a change. Now, what does that have to do with our field? A little bit, actually, quite a lot, because hearing impaired people have damaged hair cells, don't they? And when you have damaged hair cells, now remember from 120 anatomy, when you have damaged hair cells, especially damaged outer hair cells, what happens to the traveling waves taking place in your cochlea? You're going to learn more about that as we move into anatomy toward the second half of the semester, okay? You're going to learn a lot more about how the inner ear works. But when you have hair cell damage to the cochlea or inner ear, your ability to notice changes in frequencies really gets worse. You've lost frequency resolution. The ability to distinguish between frequencies really close together, that kind of gets diminished. It's like the keys on your piano got fatter. Okay? They're no longer fine little differences. You can't notice differences in frequencies that are really close together. You need bigger changes in frequency to notice that there's a change in frequency. And that has a lot to do with hearing aids, because people with sensory neural hearing loss, people who have damage to the inner ear, to hair cells, what's their biggest complaint wearing hearing aids? Background noise. They have difficulties separating speech from background noise. Why? Because their frequency resolution has gone down. Their delta F has gotten worse. In other words, they need a bigger change in frequency for them to notice that there's a change in frequency. It's like the radio is no longer fine-tuned. You got a lot of static coming in. Their hair cells are damaged, and so their ability to distinguish between frequencies close together is diminished. They have a harder time than you and I, who don't have hearing loss, separating speech from background noise. Their delta F has become worse. And by becoming worse, it means bigger changes are required for them to notice a change. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. Now we can leave that stuff behind, and let's look more at what we do in our jobs. So let's scroll down. That's all I need you to know about anything on this first paragraph. So we'll leave that alone. Oh, I got a message from Doug Dunker. Okay, well, I don't know if you can see that. Who cares? I got to answer that after class. All right. What we want to look at is absolute threshold. Absolute threshold. Okay? This means what's the smallest that you can detect? The sound isn't audible, and how much did I need to make it for you to notice that it was there? That's what you and I do, okay? We don't do differential threshold. That's for research. We do absolute threshold. That's what we do every day when we're testing hearing. So this is for us. The main type of threshold for clinical audiology or for the HIS, hearing instrument specialist, this concerns us doing hearing tests. What's the smallest value that the listener can detect? The sound isn't audible. You're not looking at the smallest change you need to make to notice a change. You're looking at the presence versus the absence of the signal. Is it there or is it not? Okay? Is it there or is it not? It's not like it's there, and what's the smallest change I needed to make for you to notice a change? Did you hear it or did you not? Period. Presence or absence. So when we say threshold in our field, we mean absolute threshold for intensity. What's the softest it took for you to hear? In decibels, what's the softest it took to hear? For example, that is the softest level to be required for a person to report that he or she heard a sound. This is what we do in routine audiometry. This is us, okay? So make that distinction clear. Now, whenever you're looking at threshold, absolute threshold, okay, you're always involving signal and noise. Now, the signal is the tone the guy's listening for. The noise is whatever interferes. Okay? The noise is whatever interferes with the person hearing the tone. The tone is the signal. That's the thing of interest. And there's always noise. And I'll stop sharing for just a second so we can talk. The noise doesn't have to be background noise. Okay? The noise is whatever crap is interfering. Okay? It can be background noise, but it could also be language barrier. So that's what we mean by noise in quotes. Noise is any BS that interferes with the proper hearing test. Maybe the person's overly eager, and raising a hand or pushing a button that he or she hears the tone and you haven't even presented anything. Or maybe the person's really hesitant and only wants to raise his hand when he's sure he hears the tone. Okay? So all of these things, attitudes, language barrier, even your instructions. What instructions did you give to the client? Did you say raise your hand or push the button as soon as you hear any sound at all? Or did you say raise your hand or push the button when you're sure you hear a sound? It's going to make a difference in the decibel level required for the person to just barely hear, because your instructions play a part. Language barrier plays a part. Attitude plays a part. Now, all of the stuff that interferes, anything even psychologically that can interfere. Maybe the person, and think of it even in reality, maybe the person swallowed during the hearing test. When he or she's trying to hear a really soft tone, you went, and the sound of your saliva in your mouth when you swallowed might have covered the really soft tone. So all of these things, okay? So now let's share screen again and look at our notes and read what we've got to say here. The client is always listening to a signal buried in some noise. Whatever it takes to just barely hear the signal is called threshold. Whatever interferes is the noise. One's threshold is thus kind of a gray area. There's no such thing as perfect, unadulterated, pure threshold. For any set threshold, the actual amount of sensation evoked in your cochlea should be completely unchanged, right? I mean, if that's what your hearing level is, that's what your hearing level is. But in all reality, this isn't always the case because we always have some noise in our system. That's why I put noise in quotes. Instructions, attentiveness, all of it. In other words, the same stimulus may produce different responses on different occasions. There's always a decision that leads to your response. I hear it versus I don't hear it. So here we get to the experiment here. And now I'm going to talk to you. We'll show you a PowerPoint slide. Okay? See if we can kind of, there you go. Blow this guy up. Here we go. Let's say, you have normal hearing. Let's pretend you can hear all the way down to 0 decibels. Okay? You got really good hearing. And I'm presenting the tone. Let's say it's 1,000 hertz tone, and I'm always presenting it at 50. Well, every time the tone is present, you're going to say, yep, I hear it. And every time the tone is absent, you're going to say, nope, I don't hear anything. So all of your responses are going to fall in true positives or true negatives. When the tone is present, you're going to say, yep, you betcha. When the tone is absent, you're going to say, no, I don't hear anything. That's because the task is easy. You can hear all the way down to 0, and I'm presenting the tone to you at 50. Okay? Let's look at what happens on this slide. Now the tone's presented at 5, at only 5 decibels. I'm going to turn off the overhead light in here. I'm getting kind of a glare. And I'll turn on a backlight. Hang on a second here. That's probably, I don't know. Maybe a little bit better ambiance, who knows. Anyway, okay. So now the tone is presented at 5. Now you're going to be squinting like Clint Eastwood. I mean, now it's hard because you may be able to hear down to 0, but 5 isn't very much more than 0. So you are now having a hard time. Your whole face is doing this. I think. Whereas with the 50 tone, you're going. Every time it was presented, you heard it. And every time you didn't hear anything, your hand stayed down. So you had all true positives, true negatives. But now when the tone is 5 instead of 50, your whole confidence is shattered. Now you are like, and that's what your clients are facing. Okay, and that's why as a clinician, you got to get good at testing hearing. And you give instructions properly. And you got to get the person to answer as well as he or she can, because you want to find out their thresholds as close as possible. And that's where we get to these terms of true positives, true negatives, false positive. Look at the now when the sound is 5. I hate that black bar. Go away. I want that thing there. Thank you. When the tone is 5, lots of times when the tone is present, you're going to say yup. Many times when the tone is absent, you're going to say I don't hear anything. But sometimes when the tone is absent, you might think you heard it when you didn't. False positive. And sometimes when the tone is present, you may not raise your hand to tell that you heard it. Maybe you didn't think you heard it. So these are correct and these are mistakes. And you're going to make mistakes when you're really close to threshold. That's what I mean. And that's when crap really interferes. Crap, or noise in quotes, doesn't interfere so much when the tone is 50 and you can hear down to 0. Okay? Then the crap in quotes, your attitude, attentiveness, instructions, all that stuff, that doesn't play so much of a part. But when I move the slide to 5, that's when the smoke now crawls under the door. That's when the devil enters the picture. Okay? That's when noise comes in. That's when the interference can play more of a part. And that's where your own internal bias can play a part too. And bias, B-I-A-S, your bias, that's the difference between what you can hear truly versus what you say you hear. Okay? So people can be biased toward giving positives, and people can be biased toward giving false negatives. You can be biased to giving false positives. You can be biased toward giving false negatives. Let's pretend you're testing Herb's hearing. Okay, he's a farmer. He's brought in by his wife, doesn't want to be there, probably has noise-induced hearing loss from the tractor and the farm implements, machinery, probably. He's 65 years old or whatever. His wife always tells him he's turning the TV up too loud. He doesn't want to admit it, doesn't want to be there at the hearing test, has a negative attitude. So what is he going to do? He doesn't want to make any mistakes in the hearing test because he feels foolish enough already. See, this is called psychoacoustics. See how different it is from physical acoustics? Because we're talking attitudes here. All of a sudden, the mind, okay? Herb doesn't want to be there. So Herb's going to not make, he doesn't want to be anyone's fool. He's going to raise his hand only when he's good and sure he hears the tone. His bias is toward false negatives. So if he can't hear until 50, he might wait until the tone is 55 or 60 before he raises his hand, because he wants to be sure he hears it. And Herb is doing this. He's listening under the headphones. He might as well just be doing this. Okay, as he doesn't want to make a mistake. He feels like an idiot being there anyway. His wife dragged him in. Okay, so he's not going to raise his hand and start guessing. He's not playing like a willing, helpful part. He's being sure he hears it. So if his threshold is 50, his bias is going to make him look like the hearing loss was worse, because he's only going to raise his hand when he's sure he hears it. So 50 decibel thresholds may really look worse than they really are. They'll look like 60 dB thresholds. See what I'm saying? Let's take Mrs. McGillicuddy now. First grade school teacher, retired, has grandchildren, comes in with her little purse and her gloves, has her legs crossed in the hearing test, and has her hands on her lap. And she's eager beaver because she loves giving tests. She always gave the kiddies tests in school. And now she feels, oh boy, I'm being tested. Isn't this fun? And she's overly eager. She's sitting there and you haven't even pushed a button yet. You see what I mean? She's biased toward false positives. And if you're not a skilled clinician, you're going to mark her down like at 40 decibels when really her hearing is at 50. Okay? So false positives, a bias toward false positives, is going to make the thresholds look better than they really are if you're not careful. So your job as a clinician is to pull Herb from the right of center to the middle, and to pull Mrs. McGillicuddy from the left of center and pull to the middle. And that's the art, the skill of doing hearing tests. Part of it's science, and part of it's experience and skill. So now let's look at our writing. What did we write here about all these things we've talked about? Let's look at our notes. Imagine an experiment where a subject listens to a tone at some decibel level. The tone is presented in 100 trials. 50% of the time the tone is absent, and 50% of the time the tone is present. True positive happens when the tone is presented and the client says yes. True negative, the tone is absent and the client says, yep, I didn't hear anything. False positive is when the tone is absent and the client says yes. That's Mrs. McGillicuddy, okay? False positive, the tone is present and the client says no. That's Herb, okay? So if the tone is well above the client's threshold, then all responses will be true positives and true negatives because it's easy. That's what the 50, the squares with 50 were, okay? That's this, okay? However, if the tone is very near the client's thresholds, then the responses will include, yes, some true positives and true negatives, but also some mistakes. Okay? That's what that's telling you. Read on with me. At At very soft, well, I don't know what the heck happened there. Let's just kind of make it bigger. At very soft listening levels, bias affects threshold. Bias, the difference between what someone can answer versus what someone does answer. Subject bias. Herb, the farmer who doesn't want to be here, his wife dragged him in. He's no one's fool, doesn't want to make a mistake on the test. He responds only when he's sure he hears the tone. He's going to give lots of false negatives. Mrs. McGillicuddy, the retired first grade teacher, wants to please. She also doesn't want to make mistakes, but her bias is in the opposite direction. She's responding constantly even when no tone is present. Lots of false positives. And then you've got other things that can screw stuff up, other origins of noise, okay, in quotes. Examiner bias, your experience, your instructions, criteria for establishing threshold. We'll talk more about this in a couple of seconds here. Language barrier. Can't overestimate its effect on giving exact instructions. And in North America, we are getting people from all over the world moving here. Where I live in Canada, lots of different cultures. We got more Syrians here. We got East Indians living here. We've got Chinese people living here. I'd say in the city of Vancouver, Canada, probably only 1 in 4 people is born speaking English. Okay, all the other ones are learning English as a second language. So it depends on where you live, but boy, oh boy, the big cities are filled with people from other countries. And you can't overestimate the importance of getting over a language barrier. Huge. I mean, think about it. I'll stop sharing for a second. Tell your mom she's going to hear tones. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going to present the tones really softly. Blah, 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 blah. Raise your hand when you hear the tone. Blah, 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 blah. Even if the tone is very soft or very faint, still raise your hand. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, you got what I mean? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, things get lost in translation. Okay, instructions. Huge. So many different factors can interfere with getting an exact true threshold. And that's basically, and the task gets harder and harder as you get toward the person's real hearing levels, because the sounds are very soft to that person. So the job gets harder. So how do we do it? We have ways and means of doing it. Excuse me, I gotta sneeze. Woo! Bless you. Okay, here goes. We have ways of doing it. We have ways and means of doing this, yeah? So, clinical audiometry uses method of limits to get around bias in finding absolute threshold. What's method of limits? That means the clinician is presenting the tone, and the clinician is adjusting the intensity, not the client. The clinician is, and the client is sitting there listening. Okay, that's one element of the method of limits. The second element of the method of limits is you are adjusting the tone in fixed increments. What do I mean by that? In plain English, you're not going 50, 51, 52. It's 50, 55, or 60, or 65. You are adjusting things in increments of 5 dB. Okay? We have a saying in this field, what's 5 dB among friends? So when you think about the audiogram having a distance between 0 decibels down to 120, all of these things are done in increments of 5 dB. Okay, so two things in your notes here define the method of limits. A, you are adjusting the tone, not the client, and B, you are adjusting the tone in fixed increments. There's an advantage to the method of limits. It's fairly fast. That's why it's done in clinic. Disadvantage is client's bias can still influence threshold if you're not good at it. In other words, like Mrs. McGillicuddy saying yes all the time, false positives, you can call her the Las Vegas gambler. She's the reckless one, okay? Or you can call Herb the chicken. He's only raising his hand when he's sure he hears it. Okay, client bias. That can still mess around a little bit with the method of limits, but basically the method of limits is about the best we've got. Not bad. Now here's how we do the method of limits. I'm going to show you a picture here. All right, blow this up. When you're testing method of limits, you can do it like the left-hand column. Look over here on the left. I can start out at 80. Did you hear it? Yep. I can go down to 70. Did you hear it? Yep. I can go down and down and down and down, or down to 65, I should say, or down to 75, down to 70, down to 65, down to 60, down to 55, down to 50, da-da-da-da-da, until the guy doesn't hear it anymore. And then I can write down the softest level that the guy heard it. Okay, that's his hearing level. Or, look at the right hand. I can ascend from 0 and go to 5 and go to 10 and then 15 and then 20 and then 25 and so on until the guy hears it, and count that as threshold. Okay? Are you going to get different thresholds with either way? Yep. I'm using method of limits both times. I'm adjusting it, and I'm adjusting it in fixed increments. But on the left, I'm descending, and on the right, I'm ascending. Now, you're going to get different thresholds with each way. And which one do you think you're going to get better? Look at the middle. You will get better. In other words, the person will hear softer at a softer level. His threshold will be the lowest if you use a descending technique rather than ascending. And how come? Read what it says on the bottom. Because when descending, you know what to listen for. You've heard it already. Ascending, you haven't heard it. So you don't know what you're listening for. Okay? So what we do is we use a combination of the two ways. Method of limits, we go down and we go up, both. And we call that the Hewson-Westlake approach. Two guys who lived in a van down by the river or whatever back in the 1950s figured this approach out. It helps to get around bias. It's not perfect, but it works pretty good. Note the clinician's skill is still important here, because you can still get your Herbs and still get your Mrs. McGillicuddies. You can still get your people that are trying to play false negatives, and you can still get false positives, but still it helps. It works pretty good. Noise is anything that interferes with the accurate detection of a signal. Language barrier, instructions, background noise. Then again, you've got your client's own internal bias, Herb, Mrs. McGillicuddy. And remember that the bias is the difference between what you can hear versus what you say you hear. And really, when you're looking at that, it's kind of like this: what you can hear and what you said you heard. Okay? So let's see if we can find this guy here. Now go over to the notes and read what we do. Houston, Westlake. We use, so you can talk about an ascending approach. We can talk about a descending approach. Well, that's what we showed in our PowerPoint slide. Descending approach is going to give you better hearing because the person knows what to listen for. Yep, we said that already. So we use a combination, and it's called the Houston-Westlake ascending-descending approach. Actually, it was invented at State Fair by people selling hearing aids to the public. But it makes a person lose orientation and respond to the best of his or her hearing ability. This is how it's done. And this is what you will do as an HIS. This is how we test hearing. Okay? You start at some decibel level that you know is audible to the person. So let's say you start at 70, and the guy raises a hand. Yep, I hear that. And remember, you're presenting a single tone. You're presenting, let's say, for example, 1,000 hertz to the right ear at 70. And the guy hears it. Raises a hand. What do you do now? You descend by 10 dB. Not 5, 10. You go down to 60. Present the tone again at 60. The guy hears it. Descend again to 50 by 10. Okay, from 60 down to 50. The guy raises his hand. Descend to 40. So you went down another 10. The guy doesn't hear it. Ah, what do you do now? Go up by 5. Now you're at 45. He doesn't hear it. Up by 5. Now you're at 50. He does hear it. Okay, so that's one ascending response at 50. Now you go down to 40 again. He doesn't hear it. Go up by 5 to 45. He doesn't hear it. Go up by 5 to 50. He does hear it. That's threshold. And what was that? 2 ascending, yes, I heard it, responses at the same dB level. Okay? That's what's marked down as threshold. And you will write that on the audiogram. You'll write a circle. It's the right ear. Or if it's the left ear, you'll put an X at 50. Okay? Under 1,000 hertz, at 50 decibels, you'll mark it with an X. If it's the left ear, you'll mark it with a circle if it's the right ear. Okay? We play tic-tac-toe in this field, X's and O's. But what do the X's and O's represent? Hearing thresholds for the right ear or for the left ear. So what did we just do? The method of limits, yep, you're adjusting the sound, and you're doing so by fixed increments. And are you using a descending approach or an ascending? You're using both. You're descending. Every time the guy hears it, you're going down by 10 until he doesn't hear it. When he doesn't hear it, you're going up by 5. Does he hear it? If he hears it, yep. Descend by 10. If he doesn't hear it, up by 5. If he doesn't hear it, up by 5. If he does hear it, that's 2 ascending responses at the same level. So, read what it says in our notes. What does it say there? And we'll read it. Go down by 10 dB. See whether there's a response. If yes, keep dropping by 10 until there's no response. Then go up by 5 until a response is noted. Go down by 10 again because you've noted a response. Now go down by 10 until no response, then rise once again. Audiometric threshold is the decibel level where you found two ascending responses at the same dB level. At the same dB level. Okay? So let's make sure we have this. So let's give another example. Present the tone at 70. Present the tone at 60. Present the tone at 50. Present the tone at 40. Present the tone at 45. Whoa. What do you do now? Down by 10, 35. Present the tone at 35, doesn't hear it. Present the tone at 40, doesn't hear it. Present the tone at 45, didn't hear it. Oh. Present the tone at 50. So you got one response at 45, one response at 50. That was ascending. You're not done yet. So you got them once at 45, you got them once at 50. So if you got them once, now you got them the second time, it's at 50. What do? You go down by 10 to 40, present. Up by 5 to 45, doesn't hear it. Up by 5 to 50, yep, okay, that's his threshold. Two ascending responses at the same decibel level. Recall earlier, once it was at 45 and once it was at 50. So you got to figure out which one of those is true. So since you were last at 50, down by 10 to 40. If he doesn't hear it, up by 5 to 45. If he did hear it, then you'd have two ascending responses at 45. That would be your threshold. Okay, so two ascending responses at the same decibel level is the threshold for the ear in question. And what are you looking for? Absolute threshold. Did he hear it or did he not, right? And what method are you using to find absolute threshold? Method of limits. What does that mean? You are adjusting the intensity of the tone, and you are doing so in fixed increments. You're not ever using 47 and 53. It's either 40, 45, or 50, okay? And how are you using the method of limits? With the Hewson-Westlake ascending, descending procedure. So there's three elements here. You're looking for absolute threshold. You're using the method of limits to do so. And how are you using the method of limits? The Hewson-Westlake method. Ascending, descending method. There you go. So this has been your first psychoacoustics foray. Okay? Now let's kind of see where our notes are taking us and go just a little further. Boy, we got neighbors upstairs who've got the dogs upstairs, and boy, oh boy, you might as well say, who let the dogs out? Because, man, are they rattling their cages up there. Okay. Intensity obviously affects threshold. Obviously, like duh, okay? But so does frequency. Okay? So if I'm below your threshold, you're not going to hear it. If I'm above your threshold, you will hear it. That's just what we meant by intensity affects frequency. Affects threshold. But frequency also affects threshold. I'm going to stop sharing here, so you got to look at my ugly mug. I'm going to have a sip of what's left of my coffee, which is almost nothing now, except a few grains. Now, remember way back in this course, in Unit 2, intensity and the decibel from hell. And remember we said in that unit, we needed to define what zero was. What's zero? 0 dB sound pressure level. Remember that one? And how was it defined? It was the softest it took for a normal hearing human to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. Remember that? And whatever pressure was against the eardrum at that condition, we called that 0 decibels SPL. And you'll even recall what that pressure was. It was 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared. That was usually the softest pressure against the eardrum required for a normal hearing human to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. So that was the pressure against the eardrum from the speaker from the real soft sound, and we called that 0 decibels sound pressure level, right? Good. Now, let's play the same game for 2,000 hertz. What's the softest it takes to hear a 2,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears? Chances are it's less. It's probably 0.0001% I don't know, but it's actually a little bit less pressure. So we have better hearing. Okay? And then 4,000 hertz. What's the softest it takes to hear a 4,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears? And we'll mark that down. And then what's the softest it takes to hear an 8,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears? And what's the softest it takes to hear a 125 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears? And 250 hertz and 500 hertz. Now you've done all 7 octaves, right? 125, 250, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, and 8,000. 7 octaves. 7 little monsters. Okay? And you've tested the softest level it took to hear all those different frequencies. And guess what? Your hearing is uneven across the frequencies. In other words, all frequencies are created equal, but some frequencies are more equal than others. Ha! What I mean is, your ear is more sensitive to some frequencies than to other frequencies. And you know why that's the case? Because of the resonance of your outer ear and the resonance of your middle ear bones. The resonance of your middle ear ossicles and the resonances of your outer ear cause some frequencies to be heard better than other frequencies. Let's now show you a picture of what I mean. So share screen and look at PowerPoint slide. Forget about that, right? Okay, let's look at this picture here, just for the heck of it. Look at this big curve. And look at the circles. The circles show the amplitude of vibration of the eardrum at threshold. In other words, what was the softest it took for the person to hear all the different frequencies. And they're measuring how much vibration took place. What was the pressure against the eardrum? At 1,000 hertz, it was about 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared. Okay, they're measuring with a different method here, but just say 1,000 hertz it was here. At 2,000 hertz, it took a little bit less. At 4,000, it was even a little bit less still. At 8,000, it got to be a little bit more again. At 500, it took more pressure. At 250, it took more pressure. At 125, it took more pressure, and so on. Then a whole bunch of researchers started looking at all this stuff. And they began to find similar curves. All of them found slightly different curves, but basically they all found this thing, this kind of like a sort of a smile with a bigger slant on the left-hand side, meaning that more dynes per centimeter squared were required to just barely hear the low frequencies, and the best frequencies of hearing were kind of between 1,000 hertz and 4,000 hertz. In other words, the fewest dynes per centimeter squared were required to just barely hear those frequencies. Okay? So once again, you're looking at the smile, sort of a lopsided smile. More lopsided smiles. This one's really weird. Ooh, don't know how the heck that one came in. Anyway, so basically, a wee bit of a review here. Recall this from Unit 2. Note, okay? The softest it took to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. The softest pressure was 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared, and we called that 0. And if we increase the pressure by a factor of 10, you're now at 20 dBSPL. Increase it by a factor of 100, you're now at 40. Remember all of this? Okay? So, and note, 120 dBSPL actually has 1,000,000 times the pressure against the eardrum as 0 dBSPL. All that's review from before the midterm. And you recall what's the difference between dB and dBSPL. Make sure we retain these pieces of knowledge, okay? Any sound that is, what do you call it, anchored or referenced to this ground, okay, is going to be stipulated in terms of dBSPL, sound pressure level. Ambient room noise, about 40 dBSPL. Average conversational speech, about 65 dBSPL. Yelling, about 80 dBSPL. The sound intensity required to start getting noise-induced hearing loss after 8 hours of exposure, 85 dBSPL. Okay, a jet engine at 1 meter distance, 120 dBSPL. Okay, all those are referenced to 0. But remember, in hearing aids, okay, when a hearing aid is adding a little bit, and I'll stop sharing here, if you've got a 50 dBSPL input and the hearing aid is adding 50 dB, okay, then your total output is the simple addition of the two, right? Input plus gain is output. Remember that? Input is always dBSPL. It could be a whisper, it could be conversational speech, it could be traffic, whatever the sound is that's entering the mic of the hearing aid. Input in dBSPL. What the hearing aid is increasing or adding is called the gain. And that's always stipulated simply in dB, because gain is relative. I could be adding 50 dB of gain to a 5 dBSPL input. I could be adding 50 dB of gain to a 20 dBSPL input. I could be adding 50 dB of gain to a 30 dBSPL input. The gain is relative. And when you're adding 2 decibel things like that together, you can, C-A-N, can underline add like 1 plus 2 is 3. So a 50 dBSPL input plus 50 decibels of increase in gain is 100 dBSPL output. And that's what's hitting your eardrum. So in hearing aids, we can and indeed do add decibels like 1 plus 2 is 3. But if a machine is making 90 dBSPL and another machine beside it is making 90 dBSPL, you're not getting 180. Remember that? When you're adding 2 different but even SPLs together, but slightly different frequencies, you only go up by 3. So 90 and 90 is 93. So that must be a gain of 3. 90 dBSPL input plus 3 dB of gain is 93 dBSPL. Okay, total. So anyway, those are review things. We need to know that. I've always just making sure we've got that. That's what this slide is talking about. That's what this slide is talking about. So make sure you look at those carefully. And I always use time as a reference as well. Just time can kind of help. If you're at, right near me, it's 20 minutes after 10 Pacific time. In Missouri, it's 20 minutes after noon. Okay? So that's your reference, Central Standard Time. And we're on daylight savings time, so Central Daylight Savings Time. That's your ground. Okay? My ground is daylight Pacific time, and it's 20 minutes after 10 here. That's my absolute value of time. And a relative value of time would be 2 hours. I can add 2 hours to 12:30, now it's 2:30. I can add 2 hours to 2:30, now it's 4:30. Okay, so the term 2 hours is a relative time value. Okay, 4 p.m. is an absolute time value. Okay, anyway. This is the slide we need to look at. MAF, minimal audible field. It's the softest level required to barely hear all the different frequencies at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. Have another Nutter Butter Peanut Butter Sandwich cookie. Okay, look at the thing carefully. 1,000 hertz. 0 dBSPL. Remember that? Okay, so that's the softest it took to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. Now let's do the same thing with 2,000 hertz. And the softest it took to just barely hear a 2,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears was actually a little bit less. than 0. Might be -2, I don't know, something, a little bit less. See, remember, 0 doesn't mean the absence of sound. 0 is the softest it took for a normal hearing human to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance with 2 ears. Look at 4,000 hertz. Softest it took to hear 4. Da, 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 da. It's going to be like almost -6 or 7. I don't know. Okay, it's less. 8,000 hertz took about 10. 500 hertz took about 7. 250 hertz took about, I don't know, 15. 125 hertz took about 40. See? So we have uneven hearing sensitivity across the frequencies. All right. And why this dip here? It's due to the resonances of our outer and middle ears. But remember this acronym, minimal audible field. It's the same game as this, only you're doing it at all the frequencies. You're finding the softest it took to just barely hear a different frequency, not 1,000 hertz, other ones. And you'll find a curve. And that curve is reminiscent of these curves and this curve. All these are minimal audible field, MAF, minimal audible field. Don't worry about this one yet, okay? MAF. But we don't test hearing with 2 ears in front of a speaker. We test hearing with 1 ear under a headphone. I mean, let's face it. Right ear, we test thresholds using method of limits, Houston-Westlake ascending, descending procedure, and then the left ear, same thing. Okay, we're not sitting a person 1 meter distance from a speaker, so minimal audible field isn't getting really at our hearing tests. It's pointing us kind of in an interesting direction. But what happens with 1 ear under a headphone? Well, when you go to 1 ear under a headphone, it's different. Now you're looking at MAP, the white curve. And notice how MAP is about 5 decibels up above. That means you need more decibels to just barely hear all the different frequencies. You still have a curve, but you got a little bump here. You have a little bump. You have the little bump over here, and the reason you have a little bump over there is because now you got a headphone on the ear. And as soon as you've got a headphone on the ear, you no longer have the outer ear canal as a quarter wave resonator. You've plugged up the ear. The cylinder ain't open at both, doesn't have a one-ended opening and closed at the other. Now both ends are closed like a barrel. Okay, so you've lost the outer ear canal resonance. Okay, so things have changed a little bit. Plus, 2 ears are about 5 decibels better than 1 ear. Okay, never think that with 1 ear that if you're deaf in 1 ear you have a 50% hearing loss. You don't. Okay, if it takes you 10 decibels to hear in 1 ear and 10 decibels to hear in the other ear, if you present the tones binaurally at the same time, your hearing will improve to about 5. Okay, say the right ear's threshold is 50, left ear's threshold is 50. Binaural thresholds will be 45. 2 ears are about 5 decibels better than 1. And that's why MAP, minimal audible pressure, represents, the white curve represents the softest it takes to just barely hear all the different frequencies, but with 1 ear under a headphone. And that gets us close to home. Okay? That gets us close to home. That's us. So the softest level it takes to hear all the different frequencies with 1 ear under a headphone is known as MAP, minimal audible pressure. And I'll finish with this. MAP is the flat line of 0 on the hearing test paper called the audiogram. Okay? And that's why this is called DBHL, DB hearing level. So now you have dB SPL, that's the ground of everything, and 0 dB HL is the ground for human hearing. Because we don't want to sit there dealing with a curve all the time. Curves are boring. I mean, it's like if this is normal, if normal at 125 is like 43, and normal at 250 is like 25, and normal at 500 is like 12, and normal at 1,000 is like 10, and normal at 2,000 is like 5 or whatever. Who wants to have all those differences? Nobody. We want to call MAP 0. And so we do. When you're testing a hearing person, the audiometer is the instrument used to present the tones. And your audiometers are calibrated to put out about this many decibels at 125. And we call that on the dial reading of your audiometer 0. And 250 at 25 dB SPL, we call that 0 dB HL. And 500 hertz, we call 10 0. So this curve is built in to the equipment that you're using to test hearing, and we call that curve 0. That's why audiometers need to be calibrated at the start of a year. Okay? They have to be redone so every year so that minimal audible pressure values are built in. We'll stop right here. Next week, we'll begin again on MAF and MAP, just as a bit of a review. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, okay? So next week, we'll continue in this unit, and we'll review MAF, MAP, and shoot on a little bit ahead. All right, good enough. I'll stop sharing, and I'll stop recording. Adios. Live long and prosper. We'll see you when we look at you.